Hello, everyone. My name is Naomi Hausman. I serve as the Director of Institutional Advancement at Gratz College. Thank you all for joining us for the second in the series of the 3 Rabbi Admiral Aaron Landis lectures. Tonight's lecture will be delivered by Dr. Rafael Medoff. You'll learn more about him in a few moments when we introduce him formally. The Landis lecture, a few words about it. It is dedicated to exploring aspects of Jews in the military and Jewish military history. The lecture is named in memory of Rabbi Admiral Aaron Landis, a Jewish admiral who led the clergy corps and also who served for many years on the Gratz Board of Governors. The Landis lecture is made possible through the generosity of Bryna and Joshua Landis and the Landis family. Please join me in thanking them and the entire Landis family for their generosity and commitment to Gratz. Before we get started, a few important notes about tonight's program. There will be an opportunity to engage in Q&A in the latter portion of the program, so please share any questions or comments in the Q&A on your toolbar. Just please note that only the moderators and presenters will see what you enter in the Q&A. Also, just want to let you know that the program will be recorded and a link to view it will be sent to everybody who registered. Also, we have a new tool on the Zoom toolbar, which is the live transcript. You'll see that on the toolbar. If you need or prefer to have closed captioning throughout the program, you can click on that tool and it'll give you a few options for having the closed captioning. So now it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Rabbi Dr. Zev Elif, the president of Gratz College. He is the author and editor of 9 books and more than 50 scholarly articles. Welcome, President Elif. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Naomi. And if you thought I was prolific, it is my absolute pleasure. Number one, to thank the Landis family. This is, as Naomi had indicated, the second installment of a series of lecture, which really I think redounds to Admiral Landis's legacy as a war veteran, as a chaplain, as a hero, as an administrator, as a leader, as a Jew, as a human being, as an American. And so who better than Professor Rafael Medoff to teach us about a very unique subject, one which has incredibly broad implications and is inspirational. Dr. Rafael Medoff is an American Jewish historian and the founding director of the David Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies, which is based in Washington, D.C., and focuses on issues relating to America's response to the Holocaust. Dr. Medoff is the author or editor of 16 books about American Jewish history and Zionism and the Holocaust. Here are some of them. 2 of the more recent, though, to call your attention to: The Jews Should Keep Quiet, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, and the Holocaust is a really important, well-acclaimed book in the field, and one which I'm very happy to, privileged to call Professor Medoff a colleague. And then one of the more recent books, although there's one on the way, stay tuned in May for a fascinating reader coming out with the Jewish Publication Society, but the Rabbi Buchenwald, The Life and Times of Herschel Schachter. Much of that will be the basis of tonight's discussion. A masterful work, not just an incredibly erudite historian and scholar, but a remarkable storyteller, a gifted writer. And it's my absolute pleasure, therefore, to introduce the Gratz community to Professor Rafael Medoff. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, President Elif, for that very warm introduction. It is an honor to be delivering the Rabbi Admiral Landis lecture, and very appropriate that I'll be speaking about one of Rabbi Landis' fellow chaplains, Rabbi Herschel Schachter, and his extraordinary experiences as a chaplain in World War II, in the liberated Buchenwald camp, and in the years afterwards. The books I've written over the years have each presented their own challenges, but I have to say that typically the most difficult part for me in creating any book is coming up with the title. And I usually procrastinate and wait till the end of the writing and researching process before I then wrestle with various titles In this case, however, the title jumped out at me almost from the very beginning, because as I delved into Herschel Schachter's life and legacy, as I began to explore his personal correspondence, the story of his life, it became very clear from early on that it was the period he spent in the liberated Buchenwald camp that transformed his life and shaped his entire future career as a Jewish communal and Jewish religious leader. Rabbi Shchachter is best known, was renowned as an orator. His speaking ability was often described in interviews I conducted with former congregants from his synagogue as mesmerizing. So I thought it would be appropriate to begin this evening's program with a very brief, 4-minute audio of Rabbi Schachter speaking, and he is specifically in this audio, as you'll hear, he is going to be recalling those first moments when he entered Buchenwald with the American troops, the unit to which he was assigned as a chaplain, as they liberated that camp in the spring of 1945. Now, as we listen to the audio, you're also going to see a series of photographs, and I want to caution you that some of them are rather disturbing, as you might expect, because they are photographs from those first moments after the liberation of Buchenwald. This is a series of Polaroid snapshots that I discovered in Rabbi Schachter's papers that have never before been published. Some of them have Rabbi Schachter in the view of the camera. Some do not. It is my supposition that the photos were taken by Rabbi Schachter's assistant, although there is no actual reference in any of the documents to these photos, so I can't be certain. But from the context, from the images you see, it's pretty clear that it was someone who was accompanying Rabbi Schachter during those first hours in Buchenwald. So we'll hear the video, we'll hear him speaking about it. You'll see images from photos that were taken right then and there. And then I'll continue with my remarks about Rabbi Schachter's life and impact. So could we play that audio visual now, please?
The most unforgettable day in my life was April 11, 1945. It was on that day that, as a young American Army chaplain, I served with frontline troops across Europe, and then, precisely on that day, came upon the infamous, notorious Buchenwald concentration camp. I had heard nothing of Buchenwald until that day. It was only my sad experience to have participated in the ravages of war, to have seen cities laid waste and homes destroyed and human beings crushed. But especially do I consider it a privilege, tragic and grievous though it was, to have come face to face with the stark, bitter, sordid reality of Jewish tragedy. As I mentioned a moment ago, I came upon this hellhole called Buchenwald within a matter of hours after the first columns of American tanks rolled through and liberated that dungeon on the face of this earth. I do indeed consider it a privilege, tragic, sad, to have been among those who literally opened the gates of hell, the crematoria. I saw hundreds of human bodies strewn in front of the ovens that were still hot, the smoke still curling upward, waiting to be shoveled into the furnaces. How can any human being ever forget such a sight? I stood there in front of those hot ovens, my eyes riveted to that view. I must tell you that whenever I even attempt to repeat this story, to relive that moment. It is exceedingly difficult to do so. I ran to seek out Jews, to find Jews who were still alive, and indeed there they were in a long series of low barracks. I ran into one after another, and there again, no matter what we have seen or heard, believe me, there simply are no words in the human vocabulary that can even remotely attempt to describe the horrors, the brutal, inhuman horrors that were perpetrated against our people. Within this huge Buchenwald camp, there was one area that was called Das kleine Lager, the small camp, that was reserved especially for the brutal treatment of Jews. I went into those barracks, and there I saw just raw planks of wood, shelves on which were strewn scraggly, stinking straw sacks. And there they were, looking down at me. Men, a few boys. There were no women in Buchenwald. But I will never forget those eyes, haunted with fear, half crazed, emaciated, more dead than alive. Spontaneously, intuitively, I felt the only language that I could speak that most of them would understand was Yiddish. And I called out, Shalom Aleichem, Yidden, ihr seid frei. You are free, the war is over. And there they were, looking out at me through incredulous eyes. But again, I can't continue. I could go on, but from that moment, I must tell you that my life changed. The impact of that experience was enormous on the whole course of my career.
In my remarks this evening, I want to share with you some of the ways, let's say the expected ways, the not so surprising ways in which Rabbi Schachter's experience in Buchenwald shaped his later career. And then I want to focus on one particularly very surprising way in which, it seems to me, the Buchenwald experience changed his life. Herschel Schachter grew up in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn during the interwar period, during the 1920s and 1930s. It was at the time one of the most it was the most heavily Jewish neighborhood in the United States, one of the most heavily Jewish in the world. He grew up in a strictly Orthodox family. He was the son of a shochet, of a ritual slaughterer, hence the family name Schachter. He actually came from a line of 8 generations of kosher butchers, although he broke with that tradition in becoming a rabbi. He studied at Yeshiva College and then at the rabbinical school, today Yeshiva University's rabbinical school, and was ordained as a rabbi in early 1941. Rabbi Schachter began his professional career on a more or less typical path, and that is he began as rabbi of a small congregation in Stamford, Connecticut, and then later set his sights on a larger stage. But while he was a rabbi in Stamford, World War II began, and he was moved to volunteer. That is to say that a clergyman like Rabbi Shchachter or like Rabbi Aaron Landis was automatically exempt from military service. But both men chose to volunteer and to join the military, which meant several weeks of training at Chaplaincy School, which was held at the campus of Harvard University. And then Rabbi Shchachter formally enlisted and was shipped out to a posting in New Orleans. He spent some time at a military outpost there in the south, and later was transferred to the Caribbean. And he could have remained there for the duration of the war. He had really a rather comfortable setup. He would, as a chaplain, he would minister to Jewish soldiers, attend to their religious needs, provide them with counseling, and also speak and give classes to local Jewish communities there in the South and Puerto Rico, where he was later stationed. And yet, remarkably, in 1944, he petitioned the army to send him to the war zone in Europe. His conscience troubled him deeply. He did not feel at ease spending the war years in relative comfort. And so he asked to be put directly in harm's way. And it took, as I found in his correspondence, it took a considerable effort to persuade the military authorities to finally agree. And they sent him to Europe, where he was attached to a unit that was seeing action in Western and Central Europe during the early months of 1945. On April 11th, 1945, he was surprised to be informed by his commanding officer that their unit, which was just outside Weimar, Germany, had just come across a concentration camp, which they had not known about. This is part of a broader topic for a separate discussion, but suffice to say that although the Roosevelt administration in Washington was fully aware of the major concentration camps and death camps in Europe to which Jews were being shipped and were being imprisoned and killed, that information was not shared with the troops on the ground. So the American military units liberating Europe from the Nazis stumbled into a number of these camps, as did the British and the Soviets, but the troops themselves had no idea and were not prepared in any way. So Rabbi Shchachter, although he was generally aware of the persecution of Jews by the Nazis, had no idea what to expect. When he was informed that the troops had just come across this camp at Buchenwald, a few miles down the road, he immediately headed there with his assistant and driver. You saw in the photos, there was a Jeep with the word chaplain in front, and we're pretty certain that was actually the Jeep that Rabbi Shchachter used during this period. And he entered Buchenwald as he described in the audio that you heard, to these shocking scenes of emaciated survivors, of piles of dead bodies, of the crematoria, and a scene, as he described it, directly out of hell. Now, Rabbi Herschel Schachter was not the only rabbinical chaplain to see any of the liberated camps. There were a handful of others attached to other units who very briefly entered some of the slave labor camps and other Nazi camps that were liberated. But in those cases, they were only there for a couple of days until their units moved on. Rabbi Shchachter had the unique experience of spending an extended period of time at Buchenwald because his unit remained in the area, and he asked for permission to stay inside the camp so that he could directly assist the survivors. This is an extraordinary story, which we won't be able to discuss in detail this evening. Obviously, it's presented in full in the book, The Rabbi Buchenwald. But in brief, he found himself in a situation where it was a scene, obviously, of overwhelming despair, disease. It was a dangerous place to be for all of the GIs and for the chaplain. Because he was fluent in Yiddish, he'd been raised in a Yiddish-speaking home, Rabbi Shchachter was able to communicate freely with the survivors and was able to provide assistance in a whole variety of ways, from conducting religious services to trying to help them locate surviving relatives in other countries, to organizing a group of several hundred children who left Buchenwald and were taken into Switzerland. Others were taken into France. And to assist them in just personal counseling for people whose lives had been shattered, who had experienced such horrors. And here was an American rabbi. This was a shocking thing for the former prisoners of Buchenwald to encounter an American rabbi in a military uniform and speaking Yiddish, no less. He spent more than 2 months in Buchenwald. every day, directly assisting the survivors and seeing what they had gone through. When he returned to the United States later in 1945, Rabbi Shchachter immediately plunged himself into the task of serving as a voice to the survivors. He undertook a cross-country speaking trip, which he went to community after community, describing to them as an eyewitness what he had seen in Buchenwald. And this was very important because the information that American Jews and the wider American community were receiving about the liberated camps was still quite limited. They were seeing images in movie newsreels, but it was fragmentary, and it was not at all the same as hearing from an American rabbi who had actually been there. So he served a very important purpose during that first year after the war in speaking around the country and in raising public awareness of what had happened to the Jews, and this was a frequent focus of his talks, and the need to create a Jewish homeland, a Jewish state in British Mandatory Palestine, in the ancient land of Israel. After that year of speaking, Rabbi Shchachter returned to the pulpit. He was offered a position in the Bronx, New York, at the Mashalu Jewish Center, where he was to remain, in fact, for the entire rest of his rabbinical career. And he was a full-time pulpit rabbi, very much in the traditional sense. But because of his experiences and because of his skills as an orator and an organizer, really the Bronx was too small a stage for Herschel Schachter. He became increasingly involved in a number of Jewish organizations. He rose to leadership positions. And in 1956, he was asked by the Rabbinical Council of America to be part of a small group, the very first rabbinical delegation to visit, American rabbinical delegation to visit the Soviet Union. Now, keep in mind that the 3 million Jews trapped behind the Iron Curtain had almost no contact with Jewish communities around the world, including the American Jewish community, for more than 40 years since the Communist Revolution. So this was an extraordinary development that the Soviets, under Khrushchev, for their own reasons, decided to allow a group of American visitors to come. Schachter, as someone who had had this extensive experience in Europe with other Yiddish-speaking Jews, was selected to be one of the leaders of this small delegation. I want to share with you an image from that trip to the Soviet Union in 1956. This is a scene from the Great Synagogue in Moscow. And if you look there at the center of the photo, the man with the dark beard and the dark hat, that's Herschel Schachter, speaking to a gigantic audience of several thousand Moscow Jews who jammed the synagogue to hear his words of comfort and solidarity and inspiration. Because for these Soviet Jews to finally have direct contact with a leader of a major Jewish community in a free country was an extraordinary experience for them, just as it was for him. And in his recollections of that visit to the Soviet Union, Rabbi Shchachter spoke about how the images of Buchenwald were very much present in his mind. That for him, the fact that the world had essentially abandoned the Jews of Europe during the Nazi era filled him with a commitment to ensure that the Jews in the Soviet Union would not be abandoned. And it fueled his commitment to becoming an activist in the Soviet Jewry protest movement, to which I'll return momentarily. Not long after he returned from the Soviet Union, Rabbi Shchachter was asked by the State Department to undertake another important task in Europe. And this was to accompany a large group of Hungarian Jews who were fleeing from that country, from Hungary, after the failed revolution against the communist dictatorship in Hungary in late 1956. I'm going to show you one image from that episode. This is actually from the kitchen of the ship. You see Rabbi Shchachter there in the middle, surrounded by a number of these Hungarian Jewish refugees. Among his other tasks was to ensure that there would be kosher food available for the some 1,000 Hungarian Jews who were taking this journey to the United States and then about to start their new lives. So Rabbi Shchachter increasingly became a figure on the national Jewish scene. It was not long before he rose to leadership not only of Orthodox organizations like the Rabbinical Council of America, but increasingly he was seen by fellow Jewish communal officials as someone who was ready for a bigger stage. Now let's keep in mind, Rabbi Schachter's range of activities in the 1960s and 70s as a leader in the Jewish community ranged far beyond his original Orthodox world and his upbringing. Here he was as chairman of the largest secular Jewish organization in America, the Conference of Presidents. When his term finished there, he was asked to chair the American Conference on Soviet Jewry, which was the first major Jewish organization to lobby and protest, national Jewish established organization to lobby and protest for Soviet Jewry, a natural outgrowth of his visits to the Soviet Union. And as he said, as well, a natural outgrowth of his ongoing perception of his life as being key to a commitment to ensure that persecuted Jews would never be abandoned again, as were the Jews in Buchenwald with whom he had spent those months. I want to show you something interesting about one of Rabbi Schachter's Soviet Jewry activities, mindful of the fact that our time is going to be a little more limited because of that interruption. But in addition to serving as national leader of the American Conference on Soviet Jewry, Rabbi Shchachter was also head of the local Bronx Council for Soviet Jews. And I want to show you a poster from a march they held because it highlights something unusual, which is going to lead me to the point I made at the very beginning about a surprising way in which Rabbi Schachter's life and career were affected by the Buchenwald experience. So this is going to be a poster from 1964. It's the 65. It's the earliest days of the Soviet Jewry protest movement in America. And it's a little hard to see because of the size, but if you look closely at the list of sponsoring organizations, you see that there's a very interesting array of groups here. You have not only some of the major secular Jewish organizations, but you also have side by side Orthodox, conservative, and Reform rabbinical groups, all joining together, setting aside their religious and ideological divisions and joining hands in this common cause. This is interesting for a number of reasons, but to me, it reflects an important question about Rabbi Schachter's outlook on the world and his life and career. Now, let me go from that poster and that interesting lineup of various Jewish organizations to reflect on this other point. Rabbi Shchachter, as I mentioned, grew up in a strictly Orthodox milieu. He went to Orthodox day schools as a youngster, studied in yeshiva college as an undergraduate, went to Orthodox rabbinical school, assumed Orthodox congregational pulpits, 2 of them, and he was very much a part of that world. And yet he went far beyond the confines of the small, at that time, very small Orthodox segment of American Jewry. I've mentioned that he was head of the Conference of Presidents of Jewish Organizations. He was the head of the National Conference on Soviet Jewry. And he was a leader, I should mention, in the Jewish chaplaincy movement, the same movement that had sponsored his and Rabbi Landis's original work as chaplains. And both of them remained active in the Jewish Welfare Board, which sponsored the Jewish chaplaincy organizations, the selection and the training of rabbinical chaplains for the U.S. military. And so again and again, throughout his professional career, we find that Rabbi Shchachter was working very closely with Jews who were very different from himself. His friendships, and I emphasize friendships here because it became clear to me from his correspondence, his documents, from videotaped interviews with him, and from many interviews that I conducted with his friends and colleagues and students and congregants. He had genuine close friendships with a number of important figures in the conservative and reform movements. For all of the differences between the different streams of Judaism, which are often amplified in matters of controversy today and were then, there was also a great deal of camaraderie and cooperation and collaboration. Rabbi Shchachter really in some ways broke the mold of the old style Orthodox leader who was confined only to Orthodox activities and only had relationships with fellow Orthodox rabbis. He was quite a different figure in that sense. And as I worked on the book, as I did the research for the Rabbi Buchenwald, and as I wrote it, I was struck again and again by this seeming paradox. Somebody coming from a strictly Orthodox background, moving in typical Orthodox circles, and yet going far beyond that world. It seems to me that this is where the Buchenwald experience played an unusual role in shaping Rabbi Schachter's attitudes and indeed his life. In joining the chaplaincy, Rabbi Shchachter stepped into a world that he had never experienced. Beginning with Chaplaincy School, he was studying and in fact rooming with, in the dormitories there, with non-Orthodox rabbis for the first time in his life, and with non-Jewish chaplains as well. So he was immersed from those days in 1942 with a whole world that he had never previously encountered. And this continued, of course, during his military service. And I want to show you a scene from a Passover Seder that he conducted in 1945. I'm going to show you this for a very specific reason, because I think this helps illustrate this fascinating aspect of Rabbi Schachter's life and work. Here you see Rabbi Shchachter is at the head table. He's seated in the middle. And here you have a group of GIs, and they're taking part in a Passover Seder. Now, I learned something very interesting in reading Rabbi Schachter's correspondence, the letters he was sending home from the battlefront in those days. He described this Passover Seder. And what was most striking about it was that it was conducted in a very unorthodox manner. And I mean that literally. This is a Passover Seder which did not take place at night, as we, of course, are all accustomed to doing. It's a deeply embedded Jewish tradition and religious obligation to hold the Passover Seder at night, because that is when the holiday of Passover actually begins. But Rabbi Shchachter was in the army, and he had to follow army regulations and military necessities. These young men were on the battlefields of Europe. This Seder was conducted somewhere in Germany while the war was raging around them. They couldn't have a Passover Seder at night because the lights in the hall where the Seder was conducted would have given away their position to the enemy. So he was ordered to hold whatever ceremonies he wanted to have. They had to be held in daytime using the daylight, because he was not going to be allowed to have lights at night. So here you have the men having a Passover Seder before it's even Passover. That's the first fascinating thing here. Second, a much smaller point, but also I think it illustrates the broader suggestion that I'm offering. I want to talk about the tallis that Rabbi Shchachter is wearing around his neck. This is not an Orthodox style tallis. All of Rabbi Schachter's life as a rabbi, he wore a much larger Orthodox style tallis. But in the army, again, there were army regulations because everything had to be compacted, fit into your army pack and so forth. The Army regulation talus was much smaller. It was not what an Orthodox rabbi would have preferred, but he had to conform to necessity here. So he's having a Passover Seder in daylight. He's wearing a talus, which from his point of view is far from ideal. And in many other respects, Herschel Schachter found that that being a military chaplain meant looking at the world in a whole different way. He had to get along with non-Orthodox Jews. Very few of the enlisted men, of the drafted and enlisted men, the GIs serving in World War II, the Jewish GIs, very few of them were Orthodox. So he was ministering to and interacting with non-Orthodox Jews. Many other of the chaplains were not Orthodox. He was dealing with non-Jewish chaplains, of course. He had to figure out how to get along, how to have respectful and helpful and cooperative relationships with a wide range of people. He was, in a sense, he was forced to embrace what we today would call diversity. When he entered Buchenwald, he encountered a very different kind of diversity. Here he found Jews from many different countries, all different backgrounds, all different religious leanings, who were all imprisoned in Buchenwald, tortured and starved because they were Jews, regardless of whether they were Orthodox or non-Orthodox or politically to the left or politically to the right. None of it mattered. It seems to me that this experience, first of having to build relationships within the army with non-Orthodox Jews, and then experiencing the most bitter way the reality of where violent anti-Semitism can lead, regardless of whichever Jewish political or religious camp you identify with. I think it left Rabbi Shchachter with a unique sense, with a unique perception and an understanding of the world, and what I would call a more relaxed attitude towards cooperation with non-Orthodox rabbis. This has always been a point of some contention in the Orthodox world, the question of to what extent Orthodox rabbis should interact with and cooperate with, and in which areas should they would they feel comfortable working with non-Orthodox rabbis. Rabbi Shchachter came down very much on the side of cooperation, because as a chaplain, as an eyewitness to Buchenwald, and then in his subsequent career as a Jewish communal leader, he came to understand that ultimately those differences, those religious and political differences, had to be set aside for the sake of the greater communal good, in order to fight for Soviet Jews, to help Hungarian Jewish refugees, to work for better American-Israel relations, to foster, in general, to foster good relations with within the American Jewish community, that those small differences had to be set aside, and he had to embrace a community in all of its pluralism and diversity. So in that sense, the Buchenwald experience, I would propose, had a very unusual and unexpected impact on Rabbi Herschel Schachter's life. It is not surprising that his experience, his direct eyewitness experience with the Holocaust, would impel him to devote so much of his time to Soviet Jews and to Israel. But remarkably, it also ultimately helped propel him down the path of extensive cooperation with Jews of all kinds, of all religious and political, cultural leanings, for the sake of the greater good of Jewish survival and the welfare of the Jewish community. And with that, and again with apologies for our technical glitch, and with an expression of gratitude to Naomi Hausman, her staff, and of course to the Landis family for generously sponsoring this lecture series, I'd like to open the floor to any questions you may have.
Dr. Medoff, thank you so much. That was excellent. And, we just go with the flow. We're ready for anything. So I'm glad we were able to make it work. And thank you for your patience as well. So we have some good questions that have come through. Let me share this first one about whether you found any mention of Rabbi Norman Feldheim in your research, who was also a Jewish chaplain in Europe, or Rabbi Kraus, who was a Hungarian rabbi, somebody who came to the US after the Hungarian Revolution. Do either of these rabbis, did they surface in your research?
No, those particular names did not come up in Rabbi Schachter's correspondence. But as far as his relations with other chaplains, he had a wide range of friendships and contacts after the war, during the war, but especially after the war, because he remained a leader in the Jewish Welfare Board's Chaplaincy Council for many decades after the war. And although I should mention, although I don't recall ever coming across any correspondence with Rabbi Landis, I have no doubt that they must have known each other from their continuing involvement in chaplaincy work over the years.
We, as Dr. Elif mentioned earlier, the first Landis lecture in this series featured Professor Jessica Cooperman. In her talk, she addressed chaplains during World War I. And so the question is, do you have a sense of whether that earlier experience of chaplains in World War I set the stage for future leadership of rabbis in these positions in World War II? Was there sort of a through line in that leadership?
Well,
I know that's like a little bit out of you're not a World War I scholar, but yeah.
Well, I would say that that the organizers, the Jewish Welfare Board, as organizers of the entire chaplaincy project, clearly whatever work they did in World War I must have helped pave the way for what they did in World War II. For Rabbi Shchachter, I never found any indication that he had any particular knowledge of or inspiration from the experiences of any Jewish chaplains in World War I. It was clear that what he was driven by was a sense that that he had a personal obligation to be sharing the burden of military service. He was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of sitting comfortably in Stamford, Connecticut as a pulpit rabbi, while other young men and other young Jews were out there on the front lines. And he felt like he wanted to be part of it. And there's an interesting discussion in the book about his parents' opposition. One cannot blame parents ever, of course, for being nervous about their child going to putting himself in harm's way. But in their case, it was clear that Rabbi Schachter's parents, who were relatively recent immigrants, were puzzled that he had chosen to go when he could have remained doing good work as as the head of a congregation in Connecticut, and yet he insisted on going, and he really had to work hard to persuade them to accept the fact that he was going off to war. You can imagine that when he left his post in Puerto Rico and was sent out to Europe, that it must have been a particularly agonizing period for his family. But happily for them, of course, he returned. He returned safe and sound, but of course, deeply shaken and transformed by those experiences.
A question here about how Rabbi Shchachter was regarded by his Orthodox rabbinic peers.
Herschel Schachter was very good at staying on good terms with everybody. He was what we would call modern Orthodox, and yet he had close personal friendships with a number of Hasidic leaders, with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, for example, but also with the Satmar Rebbe. And despite the fact that Herschel Schachter was a very committed Zionist, and at one point he was president of the religious Zionist movement in the United States, nonetheless, he was personally friendly with the Satmar Rebbe. As we know, the Satmar Hasidim were very much anti-Zionist. And yet he managed to find common ground, both within the Orthodox community and beyond. But it was fascinating for me to see, as I researched his life, how he somehow managed to stay on good terms with people across the spectrum. And of course, that served him well in all of his communal endeavors, because there were times when, for example, he was called upon to mediate conflicts between the Orthodox community in America and the Israeli government. Now, this goes back to the 1950s, and you can find the full story, of course, in the Rabbi Buchenwald. But just to mention very briefly, at one point, there was a controversy over religious secular tensions in Jerusalem, and the Satmar Hasidim and other, what we today would call Haredi groups in America, were holding protests outside the Israeli consulate in New York, which the Israeli government found very disturbing. And they called in Herschel Schachter to go and convince the Satmar leadership to pull back on these demonstrations and to allow Schachter to try to mediate the controversy. He actually went to Jerusalem in 1955 and mediated between the different factions, and eventually brokered a kind of a peace accord, at least temporarily, between the religious and secular combatants there in Jerusalem.
So this next question is interesting, and it may help to answer the question you just responded to, which is about his formative years. The question is, were there any circumstances of his growing up which may have shaped his deep commitment to serve and to continue that commitment to serve?
That was pretty much the first question I asked when I began, because with a biography, you start at the beginning. Well, actually, I started with his parents and their migration from Europe. But unfortunately, Rabbi Schachter's childhood and adolescence are the period of his life where there was least surviving correspondence and almost no surviving peers. So this was one area where I really did not have enough source material to reach a definitive answer. And I suppose this happens to a lot of biographers. You can't always get the whole story, especially when it was someone who was born in 1917. So most of his close friends and his relatives have long since passed away. I came on the scene, unfortunately, a little too late. I was not able to meet Rabbi Shchachter himself. I was, however, very fortunate to meet and interview Rebbetzin Schachter, Penina Schachter, who just passed away a few years ago. But her memory was very sharp of their life together. But again, she only met him as a young adult. So during his, what we call his formative years, unfortunately, only the scantest information was.
Right. And of course, no Facebook post to mine, right?
Absolutely not.
So we have two questions regarding your book on FDR's role in World War II. And this grapples with his decisions, including whether the FDR's decisions about whether to bomb the railways in Auschwitz. Can you talk a little bit about histories have debated this issue and whether there are any sort of quote unquote smoking guns available to us to make a firm conclusion either way?
It's really too big a topic for our limited time, but let me say something about the title of that book, since I began by explaining a little bit about the title of the Rabbi Buchenwald. The title, "The Jews Should Keep Quiet," is a close paraphrase of something which President Roosevelt said to Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, the preeminent American Jewish leader of that era, on a number of occasions. Again and again, when Rabbi Wise approached President Roosevelt and asked him to do something to help the Jewish refugees in Europe or to interrupt the mass murder process, President Roosevelt said to him, in effect, "You Jews should keep quiet." And sometimes said that almost literally. Now, of course, every president is unhappy about critics. Every president would like his potential opponents to keep quiet. But in my research for that book, I was struck how often President Roosevelt conveyed that sort of intimidating message to the most prominent Jewish leader of that era. So that's where the title comes from. The broader subject, though, of, for example, the failure to bomb Auschwitz is explored in great detail in that book. And so I'll refer you to that because of our time constraints.
Right, that'll be at the next lecture or in some point in the future. So just to, I'm gonna, if you would allow us to ask one more question. I know we're a little bit after one, but if you could take one more question, I think this would be a nice way to kind of close our session. The question is, did Rabbi Shchachter keep in touch, as far as you know, with any of the men he liberated, any of the men that were liberated from the camp?
Yes, he did. And this was for me, one of the most moving parts of the research. My interviews with survivors who saw Rabbi Shchachter and met with Rabbi Shchachter after the war. Now, in the first years after the Holocaust, and this I think has been widely documented, the subject of the Shoah, of the 6 million, was not a major topic of discussion in the American Jewish community. So, for example, gatherings of Holocaust survivors were not common in the late 40s, in the 50s, but they began to be organized more frequently later on. The first gathering of Buchenwald survivors was the 25th anniversary of the liberation. So that's 1970. And it was in a rather small venue. It was in a hotel in Manhattan. Rabbi Shchachter, of course, was there. It was a modest audience. In subsequent years, however, these gatherings became larger and began to enjoy the sponsorship of major organizations. And of course, as Holocaust-focused organizations began to emerge, then there were much more extensive of these reunions. But in any event, so Rabbi Shchachter, in addition to having occasional contacts in the 50s and 60s with individual survivors, then for the first time met an entire group of several dozen of the men who he encountered in the camp. I say men because Buchenwald was a men's camp. There were no women prisoners in Buchenwald, but an interesting separate story has to do with Rabbi Shchachter assisting Jewish women who had been held as slave laborers in camps near Buchenwald, whom he sought out to assist during the same period. Of course, that story is in the book. In any event, there were a number of very moving stories that I encountered when I interviewed survivors who were at that 25th reunion and then at some of the later reunions. And Rabbi Shchachter, again and again over the years, had the experience of giving a talk somewhere, typically at a synagogue or a Jewish community center, very often on Yom HaShoah. He was very much in demand, especially in later years, as a Yom HaShoah speaker. And then at the end of the talk, having an elderly survivor whom he had not seen since 1945 come up to him and say to him, "I was there, I remember you." These were, wow. You can imagine that these were some of the most poignant episodes in his life. And as I reviewed interviews with Rabbi Shchachter that were conducted over the years, his voice would break as he described meeting someone like that. And there are newspaper accounts, by the way, of some of these these encounters where the reporter describes how the survivor and the rabbi embraced and just would not let go of each other, because you can imagine the powerful emotions running through both of them at those times. So yes, fortunately, Rabbi Shchachter was able to meet with many of the people whom he directly assisted and whose lives he touched, sometimes in ways that he had not even realized at the time. You know, in the chaos of the liberated camp, he's helping so many people in so many different ways every day. He himself had no way of realizing how many lives he had touched and how many people he had helped in ways large and small that they always remembered, even if he had not realized it at the time.
Well, thank you so much. I am very profoundly grateful for Rabbi Shchachter for keeping those memories alive in his life, and for you and to you for keeping those his stories and those memories alive through your work. This was a really insightful and powerful, disturbing and wonderful presentation that I think I know I've learned a lot, and I'm sure that all of our 100 or so attendees have as well. So thank you so much for being part of this Landis Lecture Series, and all of you for joining us and for your excellent questions. Just wanted to, before we wrap, and invite you to join us for the third and final in this year's series of Landis Lectures that will take place on March 8th with Derek Pensler, the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History at Harvard University. If you want to learn more about those programs, about that program and other programs coming up at Gratz, you can go to our homepage, gratz.edu, and check out our calendar. If you wouldn't mind just sharing the screen. Yes, thank you so much, Suzette. I wanted to just sort of pay another tribute to our benefactor for this wonderful lecture series, to thank the Landis family. I hope you take a moment to kind of read these beautiful words in tribute to Rabbi Admiral Aaron Landis. So thank you again to the family. We're very proud at Gratz to help honor his memory. Dr. Medoff, again, we don't see you anymore. If you want to come back on and say a quick word of goodbye to everybody, you're welcome to do so. And I just want to again thank everybody. And I think it's just me now. So I'm just here to say goodnight to all, and we hope to see you again very soon. Bye-bye.